Meine Damen und Herren, schön, dass Sie wieder zurück sind nach dem köstlichen Lunch. Manche hatten gute Aussicht, konnten den wunderschönen Garten der Villa Hammerschmidt genießen. Unser nächster Vortrag wird, wie Sie sich wahrscheinlich schon gedacht haben, in englischer Sprache gegeben. Und unter den Sitzen liegen Kopfhörer, die schon voreingestellt sind. Und wenn Sie mögen, können Sie eine deutsche Übersetzung in Anspruch nehmen. Okay, please welcome the man who maps our future in a world without work, Professor Daniel Susskind. When I play his introductory music, you will hear clapping at the start. This is Steve Reich's clapping music. There is no melody, there is only a naked mathematical rhythm reminding us of Ligety's metronomes from the very beginning. It is the image of a world of machines, a world where humans are merely metronomes. Then David Bowie breaks the structure. Quote, "It's the darkest hour. You are 22, the voice of youth, the hour of dread," unquote, he sings. In this world of total efficiency, something is missing. Identity is fading. And he goes on with, quote, "Love is lost. Lost is love," unquote. We used to define ourselves through work. Now the anchor is vanishing. Look at Edward Hopper's Automat. In his days, Hopper was portraying self-serving restaurants. A woman sits alone. The world is sterile. The world is automated. She stares into her cup. The lights reflect into the void. This is the rendering of modern loneliness. The mechanical clapping of the algorithm takes over. It dictates the rhythm of labor. And then Bowie, haunting question remains. Quote, "What have you done?" Unquote. What becomes of us when a machine replaces our function? When the relentless beat of a changing economy meets the profound stillness of human isolation? Then we face the ultimate stress of our identity. Daniel Susskind asks, who are we? When the algorithm finally claims our seat at the table, what remains of our dignity, of our roles as rewritten machines? But where Hopper saw a void, Daniel Susskind sees an opening. The vanishing anchor of work is not just a loss, it is a liberation. When we are moving toward a world where we are no longer defined by the daily grind of survival, but by what we choose to do to flourish. If the algorithm takes our seat at the table of drudgery, it hands us back the keys to our own time. It is a stress test, yes, but one that allows us to reclaim our humanity from the mechanical rhythm that has controlled our lives for centuries. Daniel Susskind provides the map for this new territory. He invites us to look beyond the lonely reflection in the glass and the dawn of a world without work, a place where we rediscover our purpose, our community, and our dignity, far beyond the reach of the algorithm. Musik ab.
It's the darkest hour, you're 22. The voice of youth, the hour of dread. Darkest hour, and your voice is new. Love is lost, lost is love. Your country's new, your friends are new. Your house and even your eyes are new. Your maid is new, and your accent too. But your fear is as old as the world. Oh, what have you done?
Terrific. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much indeed for such a thoughtful introduction. I'm a big fan of Edward Hopper, actually, so I really appreciate that, though I hope to strike a more optimistic tone than he does in his work. What I want to do with you in the next 40 minutes or so is talk to you about the future of work in the age of artificial intelligence. And I want to do 6 things in particular. The first is I want to say a little bit about blue-collar work. I think many people are very comfortable with the idea that technology might be really quite disruptive for the sorts of things that blue-collar workers do, that, say, farmers and factory workers do. But they're far less comfortable with the idea that technology might be really quite disruptive for the sorts of things that white-collar workers do, that lawyers and doctors and teachers and accountants and architects and consultants, the sorts of things that they do. And so I want to begin by raising the question as to whether or not automation is just a blue-collar story, or might it not also apply to the sorts of things that some of our most expert workers do as well. Now, everything I'm about to say is driven by technology. I want to focus this afternoon, though, on one technology in particular, which is artificial intelligence. It's something that has really captured people's imaginations in the last few years. And I do think, importantly, there has been some hype and there has been some overexcitement, but nevertheless, beneath that, I think something really interesting is happening. And I want to spend a little bit of time setting out what it is that I think has happened and why it matters so much for thinking about the future of white-collar work in particular. I then want to share some thoughts on what I think is our best response to the challenge of automation, and in my view, it's an educational one, it's a training one, and we've heard in some of the questions already today that theme pop up, what education to look like in the age of AI, so I'll share some thoughts. And then finally, in the spirit of this event, I want to end with a provocation with respect to something known as artificial general intelligence, which I imagine lots of you are familiar with, but I just want to say a little bit more about it and what that might mean for how we think about the future. So that's the plan, and I want to dive straight in. So first, blue-collar work. And as I said, I think many people very comfortable with the idea that technology might be really quite disruptive for the sorts of things that blue-collar workers do. So if you take the American economy back in 1860, back then about 26.9% of the US workforce work in agriculture. Fast forward to the year 2000, and that proportion falls to just 1.2%. Now, this isn't, of course, just an American story. Here's the same story unfolding back home. The UK agricultural sector today, that top line there, produces about 5 times what it did back in 1860. But look at that bottom line, total employment. It requires just 10% of the number of workers to do it. 10% of the number of workers, 5 times the amount of output. It's not just a story about agriculture either. Here's the same story unfolding in British manufacturing. Today, British manufacturing produces about 2.5 times that top line what it did back in 1948. And yet again, look at that bottom line, requiring just 40% of the number of workers to do it. Now, these aren't just stories we see unfolding in the US and the UK. We see them unfolding around the world. And fundamentally, these are stories about technology. They're stories about farmers and factory owners using technology to produce far more than ever before, and yet, at the same time, requiring fewer and fewer people to do it. And so it seems to me, at this technological moment, the really interesting question for all of us is this just a blue-collar story? Or might these sorts of disruptions not also apply to the sorts of things that white-collar workers do? Again, lawyers, doctors, teachers, accountants, consultants, advisors, and so on. And I think instinctively, just many of us tend to be less comfortable with that idea. And in order to understand why we tend to be less comfortable, I think we've got to ask a prior question, which is, well, why do we tend to be comfortable with the idea that technology is something that does affect blue-collar workers? And I think the answer to that question is because we tend to think of the work that blue-collar workers do as being, to use a word from economics, relatively routine, relatively straightforward, relatively process-based. Whereas conversely, we tend to think of what white-collar workers do as requiring far subtler faculties, things like creativity, judgment, empathy. In short, we typically think of what white-collar workers do as being relatively non-routine. And that, I think, is instinctively why many of us have traditionally thought that white-collar work is somehow out of reach of automation. Now, I've been looking at the impact of technology on work for about 15 years now, and I think one of the important things to say is that although the stories of generative AI in the last few years are remarkable, the disruption of white-collar workers by automation was already well underway before ChatGPT became the fastest growing consumer app of all time in January 2023. So just to give you a flavor of what was happening before generative AI, here's just a flavor from across some different professions. So in education, for instance, more people signed up for Harvard's online courses in a single year than had attended the actual university in its entire existence up until that year. In the world of medicine, again, well before ChatGPT, a team of researchers at Stanford announced a system that if you give it a photo of a freckle, it will tell you as accurately as leading dermatologists whether or not that freckle is cancerous. In the legal world, on eBay, every single year, 60 million disputes arise, 60 million, and they're resolved online without any traditional lawyers using an e-mediation platform. So just to put the 60 million in context, that's 40 times the number of civil claims that are filed in the entire English and Welsh justice system. It's 3 times the number of lawsuits filed in the entire US legal system. They're resolved every year, no traditional lawyers on this website. The new concert hall in Hamburg, closer to home, incredibly beautiful space, the kind of space you look at and think, gosh, you know, only a human being with a remarkably refined aesthetic sensibility would be capable of designing a space like this. Only this space, of course, was not designed by a human being. It was designed algorithmically. Now, one of the professions I've been really interested in for a long time, quite literally the profession of white-collar work, the profession of divinity. And this is the most playful, but also the most provocative of the case studies that I want to mention. In 2011, the Catholic Church issued the first ever digital imprimatur. And for those of you who don't know, of course, the imprimatur was the official license granted by the Catholic Church to religious texts. And it granted it to this app called Confession that helps you prepare for confession. So it has tools to help you track your sin. And there's even a very helpful drop-down panel with various options for contrition to choose from. And, you know, some people laugh about it today, but, you know, actually when it came out, it's worth having a Google later on, it caused such a stir that the Vatican itself felt it had to step forward and say, look, while you're allowed to use this to prepare for confession, please remember that it isn't actually a substitute for the real thing, that did make me smile. Now, as I said, all of this was happening well before generative AI. And of course, in the last few years, we faced a sort of wave of systems, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. I want to say a little bit more on these in a moment when I set out my story for what I think has been happening in the field of artificial intelligence. But just let me make two observations about these systems for now. One is, what's really striking about all those systems before these is that they were very, very good at very specific tasks, designing a concert hall, making a medical diagnosis. What's so interesting and in some ways unsettling about these systems is the breadth, the generality of their capabilities. They're as good writing a stand-up routine as they are drafting a legal contract. And it's that generality, I think that breadth of capability that's particularly impressed and excited people. The other thing to say is that if you ask the question, what sorts of tasks and activities are these systems particularly good at doing? Well, the answer, and I think it would have been surprising to many people until recently, is, well, they're actually often good at precisely the kind of cognitive activities we traditionally associate with white-collar workers. So I want to come back to this in a little bit of time, but what I want to do now is just step back a little and set out what I think has really happened in the field of artificial intelligence in the last few years, and why I think it's so important for thinking about the future, in particular of white-collar work, of professional work. Again, I think there has been a lot of hype, but nevertheless, I do think beneath that something really interesting has happened, and I want to try and tease that out. And the story I want to tell about artificial intelligence really begins in what I call the first wave of artificial intelligence. And this took place back in the 1980s. And the 1980s were, in fact, the time when my dad, who was my co-author in writing the first book that I wrote, a man called Richard Susskind, he was doing his doctorate in artificial intelligence and the law. So almost 40 years ago, he was already trying to build systems that could solve legal problems. He was really, part of the vanguard. And something really interesting happened back home in 1986, which was that a very tricky piece of legislation was passed called the Latent Damage Act. And it just happened to turn out that the leading expert in the world at the time on this very particular piece of law was a man called Philip Capper. And Philip happened to be the dean of the law school at Oxford where my dad was doing his doctorate. And Philip came to my dad and said, look, this is completely absurd. Anytime anyone wants to understand if this law applies to them, they have to come to me. And so what he said was, look, why don't we join forces, work together and build a system based on my expertise that people could use instead of having to come to me and sitting down with me face to face. And that's exactly what they did from 1986 to 1988. They worked on the development of what would turn out to be the world's first commercially available AI system in the law. Now, this was the home screen design for the system they built. I should say, if my dad were here, he would say this was, in fact, a cool screen design in the 1980s. I've never been entirely convinced by that. Just to give you a flavor of what they were up against, here's an extract from the legislation. Section 2 of this act shall not apply to an action to which this section applies. Okay, now, English is my first language, and I can tell you that that is not a readily understandable sentence. Now, I love this, though. They published it in the form of floppy disks at a time where floppy disks genuinely were still floppy. And, I mean, essentially, what they did together was they built a gigantic decision tree where you answered yes or no questions, and you navigated through a tree that had quite literally millions of branches through it that my dad and his colleagues had manually, painstakingly crafted together in the computer science laboratory. Now, the key point for us is that they weren't just doing this in the law back then. They were doing it in medicine, in tax, in audit, in consulting. But in all these different domains, the general approach in that first wave of artificial intelligence was always the same. People thought that if you wanted to build a system to outperform a human expert, you had to sit down with a human expert, and in my dad's case, it was this man, Philip Capper. You had to get that human expert to explain to you how it was they solved whatever problem it was you were trying to automate, and then you had to try and capture that human explanation in a set of instructions or a set of rules for a system to follow, one of these sort of gigantic decision trees. Now, what's interesting is that back then they thought that by now, 40 years later, these sorts of systems would be widespread, that we'd see them everywhere. And it's true that we do see some examples of them today. So anyone who uses automated tax preparation software, that's often built on this sort of architecture. But fundamentally, this approach didn't really catch on. And as many of you will know, as the 1980s came to an end and as the 1990s began, research, interest, funding, progress in artificial intelligence dried up. And a period known as the AI winter began, when really not a lot of note happens in the field at all. But the great turning point comes in 1997. It's a moment I hope lots of you are familiar with. It's when, of course, Garry Kasparov, who at the time is the world chess champion, is beaten by a computer system owned by IBM called Deep Blue. And it's an amazing achievement. But what's so interesting about this is that if you had gone back to the 1980s and said to my dad and his colleagues, and keep in mind, they were some of the most open-minded, some of the most ambitious, some of the most progressive people thinking about AI back then. If you had asked them, do you think something like this will ever be possible? They would have said to you emphatically, no, we will never do it. And the reason why they would have said no is very important. And it's very important, again, for thinking about what's happening in the field at the moment. The reason why they would have said no was because at that time, they were of that first wave mindset. Again, they thought the only way to build a system to outperform a human being was to sit down with a human being, get them to explain to you how they solved whatever problem it was you were trying to automate, and then you had to try and capture that human explanation in a set of instructions or rules for a system to follow. But here was the problem, or at least what they thought was the problem. And Garry Kasparov is such a good example of this problem. If you sat down with Garry Kasparov and said, Garry, tell me how it is you're so good at chess. How do you do it? He might begin by giving you a few clever opening moves or closing plays, and any chess fans in the room will know that that's what he does in his books and online tutorials and so on. But in the end, he would struggle. He'd say things like, it requires gut reaction, instinct, intuition, creativity, judgment. In short, he would say, I cannot articulate to you exactly how it is I am so good at chess. And that was why my dad and his colleagues thought something like this just couldn't be automated. If a human being cannot explain how they perform a task, well, where on earth do we begin? Where do we start? They worried in writing a set of instructions for a machine to follow. Now, the big mistake that they made, and I think it's entirely understandable in retrospect, the mistake that they made, though, was not to anticipate the extraordinary growth in processing power that would happen in the decades to come. So this is one way of seeing what happened to processing power. It's a story, again, I think lots of you are probably well familiarized with. But here I'm using an index of computations per second as a measure of computational power. What we can see here is not a lot happening between 1850 and 1950, that dashed line there. And then you get what looks like a relatively linear increase in processing power. Only the key point, of course, is that this is not a linear increase in processing power. The y-axis there is not a normal axis, it's a logarithmic axis. So each step up there is a 10-fold increase in computational power. 2 steps, 100, 3 steps, 1,000, 4 steps, 10. So what you're actually looking at there is an explosive and exponential growth in processing power. And that is essentially what my dad and his colleagues missed. So by the time that Kasparov sits down with Deep Blue, and remember this is 1997, this is 30 years ago, Deep Blue was already calculating up to 330 million moves a second. And Garry Kasparov at best could maybe juggle 110 moves in his head on any one turn. He was blown out the water back then by a combination of brute force processing power and lots of data storage capability. It did not matter, and this is the key point, it did not matter that Kasparov couldn't articulate how he was so good at chess. It didn't matter. The system was able to play this game, to perform that task in a very, very different way. Now, when we were doing the research for that first book, we had a correspondence with a man called Patrick Winston, who was he was one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence. And he put it to us like this. He said, there's lots of ways of being smart that aren't smart like us. And I think this is a big challenge to particularly traditional professionals, because often we tend to think the opposite. We tend to think the only way to be smart is to be smart like us. And I think this leads to one of the most important ideas that runs through my work, and one of the most important ideas I want to share today. And it's what I call the artificial intelligence fallacy. And you see this fallacy not just in popular commentary on the future of work, but also in far more expert analysis too. And the fallacy is this. It's the mistaken assumption that the only way to develop systems that perform tasks at the level of human beings or higher is to copy or imitate or replicate the way that human beings perform that task. Now, that might have been true 40 years ago in that first wave of artificial intelligence when my dad was working away, but it's simply no longer the case. So let me give you a practical example. Look, Daniel, you don't understand. What I do in my work, or what those I work with do, requires judgment. And judgment is the sort of thing a machine can never do. And I say to you in response, the question, can a machine exercise judgment? It's the wrong question for us to be asking in light of the technological developments that are now unfolding. In fact, there are two more important questions that we should be asking. And the first is this. To what problem is judgment the solution? Why do we go to our fellow human beings and say, look, give me your judgment. I want your judgment. And the answer to that question, it seems to me, is because of uncertainty. When the facts are unclear, when the information is ambiguous, when we don't know what to do, we go to our fellow human beings and say, look, I need your judgment, perhaps based on your experience, to help me make sense of this uncertainty. And so really, the second question, the question we should be asking, isn't can a machine ever exercise judgment, but it's can a machine deal with uncertainty better than we can? And I put it to you, the answer to that question is in many cases, of course they can. Now, that's precisely what they're so good at doing. They can handle far larger bodies of data than us and make sense of it in ways that we, acting alone, simply couldn't perceive. So let me bring this down to earth and give you just a practical example. Go back to that system I mentioned. Again, pre-generative AI that tells you whether or not a freckle is cancerous as accurately as leading dermatologists. How does this system actually work? What's it actually doing here? Well, it's not trying to copy the judgment of a human doctor. It knows, it understands absolutely nothing about medicine at all. Instead, it's got, I think in this case, a database of about 140,000 past cases, which was quite a lot back in a few years ago, but today not so much. But it's got about 140,000 past cases, and it's running what's essentially a pattern recognition algorithm through those cases, hunting for similarities between all of them and the particular photo of the troubling freckle in question that you've given it. It's performing the task in an unhuman way, based on the analysis of more possible cases than any human doctor could hope to review in their lifetime. It doesn't matter, and again, this is the key point, it does not matter that a human doctor might struggle to tell you how they make a great medical diagnosis. And any of you will know that this is what happens. If you go into a doctor's clinic and they give you a diagnosis and you say, how did you come up with that? Where did that come from? Again, they might begin by pointing you to the right page of the medical encyclopedia. But in the end, they're going to say things like, well, I just had a gut reaction when I came in the room. I just had a feeling when I looked you in the eyes. I just had a sense, an instinct. It was my judgment, my intuition. It turns out that the inability of human beings to explain how we do some of the most complex, subtle, sophisticated things is far less of a bottleneck on automation than many people thought was possible in the past. Can machines think? I love the question from a sort of philosophical point of view, but from a practical point of view, and that's what we all ought to be preoccupied with, it's not really the most relevant question. And to see why, I want you to think of another system, another famous system. This one, again, owned by IBM, called Watson. And its claim to fame was that it went on the US quiz show Jeopardy back in 2011, and it beat the 2 human champions at the game of Jeopardy. Again, amazing moment. What I love about this, looking back on it 15 years later, is that the day after Watson won on Jeopardy, the Wall Street Journal ran a terrific piece by the great philosopher John Searle with the title, "Watson Doesn't Know It Won on Jeopardy." Right? Right, and it's brilliant, and it is completely true. Watson didn't let out a cry of excitement. It didn't call up its parents to say what a good job it had done. It didn't want to go down to the proverbial British pub for a drink. The system wasn't trying to copy or imitate or replicate the way that those human contestants thought or the way that they reasoned, but that did not matter. It still outperformed them. It's what I have called for a long time in my work an increasingly capable, non-thinking machine. And that, I think, is what the second wave of artificial intelligence is about. And that's, I think, broadly what we're in at the moment. Systems and machines that are using remarkable advances in processing power, in data storage capability, and particularly in the last decade or so in algorithm design, to perform tasks that require very subtle faculties from us, but perform them in fundamentally different ways. And that is how, just to return to the systems of the last few years, I think we should think about these generative systems. What has happened is remarkable, and they are extraordinarily capable. But I would say that this is just an extraordinary chapter in a far longer story, a story that has been unfolding now for many years, of systems and machines gradually, but pretty relentlessly, taking on more and more activities that until recently we just thought only human beings alone could ever do. And this is one of the reasons that I think white-collar workers ought to take these disruptions very seriously now. And I want to bring these ideas back to the world of work. I should say, I think one of the unhelpful things we do when we talk about the future of work, and I've done it already several times today, is that we talk about the different jobs that people do. We talk about lawyers, and doctors, and consultants, and teachers, but actually the term jobs is really unhelpful. And it's unhelpful because it encourages us to think of the work that people do as being a kind of monolithic, indivisible lump of stuff. That lawyers do lawyering, that doctors do, doctoring. But clearly that isn't right. And it's an obvious point, but it's an important one, which is that if you look at any job, what you see is that people perform a wide variety of different individual tasks and activities in their jobs. Now, why does this distinction between thinking top-down in terms of jobs and bottom-up in terms of tasks matter for thinking about the future of work? When we originally published that first book, The Economist wrote a terrific review of it, and alongside it was this cartoon that I love of Professor Dr. Robot QC. Now, the risk when we think about the future of work in terms of entire jobs is that it traps us in a mindset where the only way that technology can affect the work that we do is by destroying or indeed creating entire jobs in an instant. That one day you'll turn up at work and find Professor Dr. Robot QC or indeed one of their relatives sitting at your desk. Your job will have been taken by a robot. Think how often you hear that phrase in the popular press. But clearly, that isn't how technology affects the work that we do. What it does is in a far more subtle way, it might displace us from performing particular tasks, reducing the demand for us to do those activities, but at the same time, it can also increase the demand for us to do activities that haven't yet been automated. And I want to return to that thought in a moment. But for now, this is the first reason that I think white-collar workers have to take these disruptions very seriously now. And it's what I call decomposition or disaggregation. Because when you take any job and break the job down into all those individual tasks that make it up, the first thing that you see time and again, to use a word that I used at the start, is that many of those tasks turn out to be relatively routine and can be automated accordingly. Not everything that even our most expert workers do require subtle faculties like creativity or judgment or empathy. So just to really hammer that point home, McKinsey did a study of the US labor market, again, before generative AI, and what they found was that only 5% of jobs could be fully automated. given existing technologies. In other words, looked at from the top down in terms of entire jobs, the impact of automation on the US labor market looks relatively muted. Only a very tiny minority of jobs can be automated. However, what they found in the same report was that 60% of jobs involved individual tasks, 30% or more of which could be automated. In other words, looked at from the bottom up in terms of individual tasks, the majority of jobs in the US labor market had a very significant chunk, again, before generative AI, that could be done very differently through technology. The second reason that I think white-collar workers have to take these disruptions seriously is this AI fallacy that I mentioned before. Because it's a mistake to think that even some of those non-routine tasks can't be taken on by the latest technologies too. You know, the temptation is to say that because machines can't think like human beings, they'll never be creative. Because machines can't reason like human beings, they'll never exercise judgment. Because machines can't feel like human beings, they'll never be empathetic. And all those claims might be completely right. But what they fail to recognize is that while systems and machines might not think like us or reason like us or feel like us, they might be able to perform tasks that require those very subtle faculties from us, but perform them by performing them in a fundamentally different way to us. Again, thanks to these advances in processing power, in data storage capability, and more recently in algorithm design. So what should we do? How should we respond? I do think for now the best response we have is an educational one. It's a training one. Because it seems to me the most likely story for the medium term is that if you think about those tasks that even the most capable technologies cannot yet do, and clearly there are large areas of our lives that cannot yet be automated, it seems to me the most likely story for now is that we're going to see an increase in demand for these tasks and activities, for human beings to do this work. And so the challenge, in my view, again, in the medium run, is not one of mass unemployment, but instead, particularly in the world of white-collar work, it's one of mass redeployment. The question is, how do we prepare the next generation to do the work that is going to have to be done? And this is the subject of my next book, which is out later in the year, What Should My Children Do? The title comes from the fact that wherever I am in the world, whoever I'm talking to, this is overwhelmingly the question I get asked the most. People say, look, this is all very interesting for me, but I've got several children at home, what on earth should they do? So I thought I'd try and directly answer it. Very crudely, just to add to some of the comments about education and training we've heard so far today, I think there are three dimensions to this: the what, the how, and the when. What skills and what capabilities are we providing people with? Very crudely, I think there are two strategies here. Either we ought to be teaching the next generation to compete with these systems and machines, to do the sorts of things they cannot yet do, or we ought to be training people to use these systems and machines, to be capable of understanding how they work, putting them to effective use, but also putting them to critical use. As you all know, AI is not like a calculator. It makes mistakes, sometimes horrific ones. And so being able to make critical use of these technologies is incredibly important. That might sound relatively anodyne, relatively straightforward. But I put it to you, if you look at what we actually do in practice, often it's neither of these things. Often we are still training young people to do precisely the kind of routine activities these technologies are already very good at doing. Similarly, people talk a good game about teaching people to use these technologies. I think, and I caused some controversy back home for saying this, but I think if we're going to take seriously the idea of teaching the next generation to use these technologies, I think we ought to be spending about a third of our time throughout education, primary, secondary, university, professional settings, teaching people how to make effective use of these technologies in each of these different, in whatever domain they happen to be operating in. The what is the issue that takes up most of the oxygen today. What skills and what capabilities should we be teaching people? But I also think there's a how. How are we training and educating people? If you were to go into a time machine, go back 100 years and walk into a classroom or a lecture theatre, it would look remarkably similar to how they look today, despite the existence of many fascinating technological alternatives. And perhaps we can talk a little bit about what those might look like in the questions and the discussion. And then finally, there's also the when. At what moment in people's lives do we intervene to provide them with education and training? There is a huge amount of uncertainty about the future, about what jobs are going to have to be done, what skills and capabilities are going to be most valuable and important. And the best response that we have to uncertainty is flexibility, a willingness and a capacity to retrain and reskill later on in life with the same intensity and seriousness with which we are meant to engage with education at the start of our lives. Now, I know today, all across the corporate world, people talk about lifelong learning, and governments have things like personalized learning budgets to make amounts of money available for retraining and reskilling later in life. But the point I would make is that if you look at the resources we actually put behind these kind of initiatives, it's just pathetic in comparison to the scale of investment that we make in people at the start of their lives. The investment that we make in people in the start of their lives through education is the biggest investment by far that the state will make in any individual. Hundreds and thousands of pounds, dollars, whatever currency you choose. And yet, once you're out there in the world, there's very little available at all, and that just can't be right. So I think if we're thinking about education and training, we need to think about it through a variety of different lenses. I want to finish, though, now just with a provocation as we think, not in the medium term, but perhaps further into the 21st century. And this was just the last few minutes, because it really is quite striking that if you listen to the leaders of the large technology companies, whether it's Demis Hassabis at DeepMind, Dario Amodei at Anthropic, or Sam Altman at OpenAI, all of them are saying roughly the same thing at the moment, which is that within 5 to 10 years, we're going to build systems that can outperform human beings at all economically useful tasks that we do. Now, I know the temptation is to want to dismiss those sorts of claims as science fiction, and I do think there are, of course, good reasons not for taking those claims entirely seriously, not least the strong financial interest that these companies have for talking up the capabilities of what they're building. But nevertheless, I do think there are reasons for also taking those claims seriously. And so let me just give you 3 that are on my mind. One are the just extraordinary amounts of resource that are going into developing these technologies. We've never invested so much in the pursuit of a single technical problem as we're currently investing in the pursuit of AGI. So this year alone, we will invest more than twice what we invested during the entire 10-year Apollo project to put man on the moon. This year alone, we'll invest twice that in the pursuit of AGI. It's also the fact that it's really striking how many talented people are going into this field, into computer science. I was really struck by this chart a few years ago showing that for the first time in history, in 2022, the share of bachelor's degrees in the US in computer science was neck and neck with the share of bachelor's degrees in all of humanities combined. There is a sense in which we're currently reorganizing, whether we intend to or not, reorganizing higher education in certain parts of the world in pursuit of these technologies. The final thing I would say is that we're just making progress. And I see this in my own work. I was struck by this piece in the Financial Times a couple of years ago talking about how progress in AI is so rapid and so jagged, we're running out of good benchmarks with which to reliably measure that progress. And it's something that I come across in my own work and thinking about the impact of technology on work. So all of this is to say, just this question, what if we succeed? What if we actually build systems that even get close to what these leaders of these large technology companies are saying? What if AGI? It seems to me to be a really important question for us to be asking. Do I think it's inevitable? Of course not. But do I think it's possible? Do I think it's a scenario that we ought to be entertaining? I do think so. And the consequences for how we work and for how we live together in society are so profound. And one of the things I just find very striking as I talk to lots of different groups, business leaders, politicians, policymakers, is how few of them are taking this sort of scenario seriously. Again, I don't think it's inevitable, but it seems to me to be entirely possible. And given the consequences are likely to be so profound, it's something that, and I'll finish with that provocation, that I think all of us ought to be thinking very carefully about. So I will finish there. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward now to hearing some questions and reflections. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. When you talked about Kasparov, I think you mentioned something like emergent behavior, in the sense that he cannot explain why he's such a good player,
Yes.
so that he could build an expert system.
Yes.
In other words, when he was educated or did educate himself,
Yes.
something was emergent in himself.
Yes.
And that resonated greatly with me.
Yes.
And I want to tell you why, and then maybe the question. I studied mathematics, and in my beginning semester we were 350 students. We had the best teachers here at the University of Bonn.
And you were at Bonn, yes.
Right.
Yes.
The best teachers, one might say, you could imagine. But only one of them became a professor.
Yes.
Despite the fact that there were many among my peer group who were brilliant students.
Yes.
In other words, they got the same education, their exams and everything they had to provide as successful students was brilliant, but they did not have this emergent thing happening in themselves to become a research professor. And that's very similar to Kasparov.
Yes.
And now the question, is it thinkable that these new tools could be used to awaken more emergent behavior in students? Because what we do right now in teaching is we feed them the same thing.
Yes.
Because we believe if we feed that kind of stuff, we do the right thing, but only every so often some emergent awakening behavior happens.
Yes.
And in individualizing teaching and education, maybe these tools could be geared towards somehow shuffling more of this emergent behavior coming to the surface.
Yeah.
Is that a valid
so I would
idea?
say it's a really interesting observation, and I would say it holds both for the systems themselves and for those that interact with them. One of the really interesting comments that Dario Amodei, who's the co-founder of Anthropic, made was someone talked to him about building these systems, and he said, no, we're not building them, we're growing them. There's a sense in which these systems are, not biological, but they are, emergent is a really good word.
Right.
And with that, there's a separate observation that with that emergent behavior comes opacity. It can be more difficult to understand how they work. One of the great merits of the systems my dad was building was that they were incredibly transparent. If you wanted to understand the reasoning that a legal system reached that he built, you could follow the decision. That doesn't hold with these systems. Your point about could they prompt more emergent behavior from human beings? I'm incredibly. I really am excited about the promise of using these technologies in education. I think there's a defensive posture you can take, which is to say, look, this is the water the next generation are going to swim in. They are going to leave school, they're going to leave university, and their world is going to be saturated with these technologies. So the idea that we're teaching them in these sort of coddled, AI-free environments is just not preparing them for the world. But there's another view, which is not simply the defensive one, but the sort of one that you're describing, which is that we ought to be using these technologies to help students do things that they couldn't do before. And that attitude is one that I think many people in education are very cynical about at the moment, but I think it's just a tremendous mistake. Yeah.
Your questions, yes.
Hi, thanks. I'm Gerhard Fettweis. And I have a question. That is, your claim that this is like the world's largest investment ever. I see that the projections are about 4.8 to 5 trillion by the end of 2033, which is far less than 5% of the world's GDP. And real-world investments hit 10%. Therefore, it's actually small compared to what happened during the railroad times. what do you think about that? So putting this into perspective,
Yeah.
we have to keep our feet on the ground
Yeah,
and not start going all over the place.
No, so I disagree with that. I recently edited a volume on the economics of AGI, and I opened it with this statistic about it being the largest investment. And somebody said exactly that, which is that, well, look, you shouldn't talk about it in absolute terms. And if we're talking about it in absolute terms, if you adjust, for the way prices have changed, it's still vastly more in absolute terms than the railway or
Yeah,
than...
but I mean, who cares about absolute terms?
Well, but I think absolute terms is important because it gives you a sense of how much financial resource we are putting into it. I care about absolute because I think it gives you a sense of exactly that. I don't see why, and this is another kind of, we could have this argument, but I don't see why articulating an investment as a percentage of GDP is somehow more insightful than articulating it in absolute terms. I'm an absolutist on that. But the other point to make, though, is the reason I think that your statistic is valuable isn't because it gives you a sense of what the scale of the ambition, but it gives you a sense of why those who might worry about the sorts of investments being kind of unsustainable or hyperbolic might need to revise their views. That if you're wanting to know if a scale of investment is sustainable, then having it as a percentage of GDP is useful.
Markus Gabriel?
So, well, thank you very much. One question on, automation.
Yes.
Because, some bits of the premises of your argument assume that replacing task, point by point is the most likely or possible trajectory. Why think of replacing rather than enhancing? In particular, when you go to the projection of AGI, right? So, that's a premise where, I would question the argument and just would like to hear more why you think that replacement is the way to go. Because the statistics point also in the other direction, enhancing productivity not by replacing, but by enhancing the various tasks. So, given that work is a complex field, right? So, why think of work along your lines then, if you break it down tasks in this linear way rather than in a more complex field-like way? And the second question related to AGI, that might be interesting to look at mu0 because you mentioned Demis's habits. So, Demis, of course, thinks other people mostly in Google that they have reached AGI at this point along the lines of mu0. So I don't know if people know mu0. So, AlphaGo beat, the world's leading Go champion, which was much harder than beating Kasparov due to various reasons having to do with, Go. But the most recent system is called mu0. So mu0 is not trained on anything. It just watches one game and then beats humans in chess, Go, Shogu, Atari games, etc. So there's nothing that even looks like knowing the rules of the game. So I think that, we're even, along the lines of your projection, we are way beyond what many people, I think, imagining is already possible, which is why a lot of the DeepMind people think that they have AGI. And so the question is, what do you think this will, what's your take on this?
Sure. So let me start in the beginning on the sort of economics of this. So you're absolutely right, which is that the impact of, technology has two very different effects on the labor market. On the one hand, it can substitute for us, displacing us from performing particular tasks and activities. On the other hand, it can complement us. It can make us more productive, or in other ways, it can increase the demand for us to do other activities. And the story of automation over the last, essentially since the beginning of modern economic growth and the Industrial Revolution, is a story of the battle between these two forces, a story of people worrying time and again that technologies of their time would lead to vast pools of unemployed people, and a story where those worries have turned out every time to be wrong. And they've been wrong for your sorts of reasons, which is that in this battle between these two forces, technology has tended to complement, to augment, more than it's tended to substitute. Although there's been huge, costs and difficulties in transition and so on. And so the question to ask is, why is it not simply that this substituting force might be stronger in the future, but why also might this complementing force be weaker? Why might it be that these technologies don't make us more productive in the way that technologies in the past have? And I think there are good reasons to think that that's the case. Just one, slightly anecdotal, but you'll catch the sort of the flavor of what I'm talking about. One of the really interesting things that happened after Kasparov lost in 1997 was he had this sort of it was a sort of existential moment for him. He was, wondering what his future would be at the chess table, and he came up with this sort of what he realized quite quickly was that although AI could beat any human chess player, including him, if he had an AI alongside him, he could then beat any AI. In other words, human plus AI was better than AI alone. And so this became his sort of, and he generalized this. He said, this isn't true just in chess, it's true across the economy. If people have access to AI, working alongside AI, they will always outperform AI. And in the world of chess, it was called centaur chess. The idea half human, half machine would always beat. The problem is, and exactly the system that you're describing, is that the centaur has now been decapitated. Right, in the sense that having a human being operating with that system versus the system alone, the human being just gets in the way. Whatever it was that the human being was bringing to the chess table, these AIs now do more productively themselves. Yeah, so, another way to, if I generalize it again, or let me give you another more anecdotal example. When GPS systems were first released, it made human drivers better at the wheel. We were more productive. We could drive in unfamiliar roads. We could get from A to B more efficiently. Today, in the context of Waymos and driverless cars, GPS just makes the driverless car more efficient. It complements the machine driving the wheel instead. In other words, what it was that a human being was bringing to the table and that these technologies were then complementing us in is now itself being done by technology. And this is what I worry about more and more, which is that the range of tasks in which human beings are complemented by these technologies is getting narrower and narrower. 300 years ago, if any new activity had to be done in the economy, it was very likely that human beings had the upper hand in doing it. Today, as these technologies become more and more capable, it becomes less and less likely. And so, that's one of my fears, which is that this AI plus machine is always better than a machine. Sorry, AI plus a human being is always better than a machine alone, AI alone. I don't think that's. I don't think there's anything law-like about that. Now that's a simplified story, but you can kind of catch the gist of the argument that I'm making.
Ralf Österreich, CIO of an insurance company.
Yes.
So following up on your last point, you mentioned education as a response. Can you elaborate a little more on the what? Like what from your perspective should we focus on education? Humanities, computer science, so whatever it might be.
Yeah. So I think there are two really important parts to this. I think let me start from what we shouldn't do, which is what we've been doing until now, which is trying to think very cleverly about the future, to predict what jobs are going to have to be done, and then reason back and say, as a result, these are the skills you need to do today. I think the future's too uncertain for that. Just to give you one example, before I went into academia, I worked in the British government, I worked for David Cameron and Gordon Brown, and shortly after I left, David Cameron made England and Wales the first place so this was 2013, the first place in the world, because of the technological changes that were unfolding. He said, we are going to be the first place in the world where every single child in primary and secondary school has to learn to code. And that became a key part of AI strategies around the world. Fast forward 10 years, what does it turn out these AI systems are particularly good at doing? Writing code. So something that well-intentioned people thought would protect a generation, not simply protect them, but actually make them flourish, turned out to be precisely what we ought not to have been teaching them. It's not to say that these technologies can do everything, coding, but it's to say that the sorts of things we were teaching young people is exactly the sorts of routine coding these technologies can do. And it was just, so I think these attempts to kind of future-proof, I think that it's a folly. So I think we've got to take the uncertainty as given and say, given we know so little about the future, how can we prepare the next generation to flourish? And I think there are two things. We only know two things about the future. One is it's going to be saturated with technologies that are far more capable than those that exist today. The second is we know very little else about it. So one thing I would start with is a kind of back to basics. The fact that around the world since 2009, literacy, numeracy, and critical thinking have plummeted is a disaster, because what we know is whatever skills and capabilities are going to be valuable and important in the future, they are in some sense going to be a function of those basic skills. And so if people don't have those basics, that's a disaster. We also have to teach people how to use these technologies, not simply use them effectively, but also, as I said, use them critically. I think it's really important that people understand not simply their strengths, but also their weaknesses and so on. I think the big challenge is how you do both of those things at the same time. One of the worries that people have is that these systems undermine the ability of people to learn basic. In fact, the existence of these AI systems is meaning people are not doing basic literacy, numeracy, and problem solving. And so what I set out in the book is, I think, a novel strategy, and I'll leave it there to sort of whet your appetite, but a novel strategy for how we can do both of those things at the same time. I think that is one of the big challenges at the moment. How can we make sure we are protecting those and teaching young people to do how to use these technologies effectively while not at the same time undermining these basics, which are just going to be, whatever the future looks like, so valuable and important.
Daniel, could you end on a very brief note on
Yes.
Edward Hopper?
Edward Hopper?
Yes.
Yes.
Why is he not right about what we are talking about? So what is your optimism founded in? Just in a brief final note.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one response is that I don't feel I quite like Edward Hopper's atmosphere, even though some people don't. Another is, in a funny way, what I'm describing is a symptom of success. For most of human history, for most of the 300,000 years that we've been around, economic life was essentially stagnant. So whether you were a hunter-gatherer laboring away in the Stone Age or someone toiling away in the Industrial Revolution, your lives would have differed in lots of different respects. But from an economic point of view, it would have looked remarkably similar, a kind of relentless, unforgiving struggle for subsistence. In the 21st century, technological progress, it's already basically done it, but it's going to solve that fundamental economic problem. How do we make the economic pie large enough for everyone to live on? It's going to replace it with other problems. How do we share out that income in society? Of our traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do, is less effective than it was in the past. How do we provide people with meaning and purpose if work no longer sits at the center of their lives? But in my view, in the final analysis, these are far better problems to have to grapple with than the one that quite literally haunted our ancestors for millennia, which was how to make the pie big enough in the first place. Yes. Yeah, so it's a very these are really difficult problems, and there's immense disagreement. But fundamentally, it seems to me they're a different category of problem to the traditional problem of humankind, which is one of how do we create enough prosperity so we can flourish.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much.